What's the difference between a serif font and a sans-serif font? Well, we have two letters on the screen here, one of which is in a serif font and the other of which is in a sans-serif font. This letter T here on the left is in Arial, which is a sans-serif font, and this letter T on the right is in Times New Roman, which is a serif font. And it's quite easy to see the difference between these two letters. It's quite easy to see the main difference between these two letters. And that's this one here, which is in Times New Roman, has these bits on the ends of the letter form here. And those bits are the serifs. Those slight extensions at the end of different letters are the serifs, as opposed to this vertical line and this horizontal line here, which form the main structure of the T. Those lines are obviously integral components of what the letter T is, and these bits on the end here are decorative, and they are the serifs. That's the difference between a serif font and a sans-serif font. A serif font has serifs, and we can even see if we change this for some other letters. You can see here the letter E is a very good one to see them on. You can see that they extend down here and out here and so on, whereas if we do that with our sans-serif font, it doesn't have any of those. It's just those basic lines, those core structural lines. Now, which of these should you use, generally speaking, for a book? If you're writing a novel, a fiction book of some kind, which of these should you use? Well, this is quite a big question to ask in terms of what font should you use for your book. This is a very big question to ask, and certainly too big to be answered in just one video like this. But generally speaking, in fiction books, let me just change these back to letters T. Generally speaking, in fiction books, it's much more common to see serif fonts used than sans-serif fonts. That's not to say that you exclusively see serif fonts used. You do see some books that use sans-serif fonts, but it's much more common to see serif fonts like this, although not Times New Roman. We'll get onto that in a moment. It's much more common to see serif fonts. Now, why is this? Well, it's largely just because serif fonts are thought of as more elegant, and they do look particularly elegant when you see them printed. You know, we're used to, when we're writing and editing books, we're used to seeing fonts, or used to seeing text in particular typefaces on the screen. And I mean, I would say that actually on screen it tends to be that sans-serif fonts tend to look better than serif fonts, particularly at small font sizes. I mean, we're looking at very big font sizes here, so we can see all of the detail. But at small font sizes, actually, I'd say on screen sans-serif fonts tend to look better, which is why sans-serif fonts tend to be more common on the internet. But in printed text, I would say, and I think a lot of people, when they see the two printed out side by side, would say serif fonts do look particularly nice when printed out. There is also some, I think, speculation, some hypothesis that serif fonts are perhaps a little bit easier to read for most people when printed out, although that's a little bit contentious. But that's generally the reason why serif fonts are used. They are thought of as more elegant, they're thought of as more classical. Certainly the type of book that you're writing, the genre of book, can also affect this. Because serif fonts have this sort of classical feel to them and this classical look to them, if you're writing a story which is more classical in feel, if you're writing fantasy or something, it really makes sense to use a serif font. Whereas sans-serif fonts can have this more modern feel because they are a more modern font, they're a more modern design. So they can have a more modern feel, and so if you're writing science fiction, then you might be able to more easily get away with a sans-serif font. As I said, there's a lot more that goes into deciding on what kind of font you should use when it comes to writing a book. And here we're just looking at the difference between sans-serif and serif fonts, and within the two groups of sans-serif and serif fonts, there's so many subcategories and extra details and styles that make a huge difference in terms of what kind of font you would choose. Here we're just looking really at the idea that serif fonts are more common. to come back to the idea of the differences between serif and sans-serif fonts, the proportions of the letters, of course, can make a huge difference to the look and sense of the font. But even among serif fonts, there's a huge variation in the designs of serifs. I mean, Times New Roman is or was the default font for Microsoft Word for a very long time, and it's now Calibri. I mean, interestingly, let's just change this one on the left, which is currently Arial. Let's just change that to Calibri, not Calibri Light, just Calibri. Now you see that this here, I mean, this isn't all that different from Arial in many ways. It's largely just the ends that have changed, but it really changes the look and feel of the font just by having those rounded ends there. And you can, even when you're dealing with a small font size, you can see this. I personally am not a huge fan of Calibri in most cases. In fact, I'm so much not a huge fan of it. I'm going to I'm going to just undo that there. But going back to serif fonts, if we change this to Garamond, and actually if we have this still as Times New Roman on the left, you can see here that, I mean, Times New Roman, previously the default font for Microsoft Word. Garamond is a very, very common, very popular font to use in all kinds of shows in the books. I have used Garamond in my books many, many times. But you can see here there's a drastic difference in the serifs between Garamond and Times New Roman. When you increase the font size like this, you can really see the difference. These ones come up here. You know, that whole bit is a serif. They stick out to the sides a bit more. This is very asymmetric as well. This one leans out much more than this one on the right does. And if you look actually very closely just there, you can see that there's a slight bend in the top of the letter form there, which you don't get in the much more geometric looking Times New Roman. And similarly, down at this part of the letter here, I mean, look at the base of this letter. Not only is this very asymmetric, it's, you know, a bit more curved on the left and a bit more angular on the right, but there's also this upward dent here, just underneath the letter. So they can change really quite drastically. I mean, let's do a similar thing with the letter E. Gosh, you can now really see the difference between Garamond, which has got these very quite naturalistic, really, looking lines. I mean, Garamond is designed to emulate those, you know, classical font, like metal type fonts, compared to the much more geometric Times New Roman. Garamond is incredibly popular. I've used it. Lots of people use it. Without wanting to go too far into a discussion of the best kind of serif font to use, let's just have a look at EB Garamond, which is a favourite of mine. EB Garamond, many similar qualities to Garamond, but just slightly different proportions, a little bit more symmetric, a little bit more structured. It's still got a lot of those naturalistic qualities, slight sort of bends in different places, you know, asymmetries here and there, but just a little bit more elegant than regular Garamond. EB Garamond is an absolute favourite of mine. I really like using it, and it's I mean, look at that. Look at the difference with the T in just regular Garamond. Look how that right-hand serif there is, whereas it's very different over here. It's actually leaning inwards a little bit. So even among serif fonts, there's huge variation in what you're getting. Here we're dealing with fonts that you could well use in books, but there are many kinds of serif fonts that you wouldn't use in books because they are more decorative. So those are the differences in very broad terms between sans-serif and serif fonts, and whether you would tend to use, be more inclined to use one for a fiction book, or indeed a book that has a similar structure to a fiction book, so a non-fiction book but it's mostly text, those kinds of books, which one you might be more inclined to use for something like that.